Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Patterson, and I wanted to share with you an overview of the newly released dietary guidelines that were released January 2026. And these guidelines follow a different path as how they were developed compared to the rigor that has been used to develop the previous dietary guidelines. So these dietary guidelines come out every 5 years, and there is a Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee that's made up of about 9, 10 members or expert members that include dietitians and physicians and people who are well versed in the nutrition area. And then there's also about 50 members that are associated with these subcommittees. Okay, so we're looking at about 60 people who are used, 60 professionals, health professionals that are used to develop these dietary guidelines. And they use rigorous methods, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses to establish these guidelines. And it takes them about 2 years to develop the dietary guidelines. So this advisory committee came up with, and let me review the numbers so I don't get it incorrectly, 56 recommendations for the dietary guidelines. Now, these that are actually published include only 14 of the expert advisory committee recommendations, and the remaining are developed using a process that's basically just an umbrella review that was conducted by about 9 individuals. None of them were dietitians. Many of them had connections to industry such as pork and beef and dairy. And they came up with these recommendations based on these narrative reviews. So they didn't use the rigor that the previous advisory committee had used to develop the guidelines. So I want to just go through them because there's going to be a lot of confusion. As if nutrition wasn't confusing before, it's now even more confusing. And their recommendations in these dietary guidelines that we have to understand are not going to change the RDA or the DRIs. So, for example, they are recommending 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, but the RDA is still 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. I actually think that recommendation is pretty solid. We've done a lot of great protein research over the past 50, 60 years when the guidelines were really established, that 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. However, it's going to be confusing to the public because they're going to go by the RDA, 0.8 grams per kilogram, and then they're going to see this and say, oh, wait, I actually need 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So just adding to the confusion. And then we as dietitians and nutrition professionals, we know based on the literature that a plant-based diet and plant proteins are appropriate in what we should be recommending. Now, yes, there is a place for animal-based proteins, but when we have this figure here that's showing red meat, cheese, and beef, and a big turkey and whole milk here front and center, I mean, that's where people's eyes are going. And so that sends the message that, oh, we should be eating red meat, we should be eating beef, cheese, turkey, drinking whole milk and full fat dairy every single day. And we know that if you go by the other dietary guidelines, really and even a Mediterranean and DASH diet, it's really limiting the amount of red meat in the diet to about 2 to 3 servings per week, limiting the saturated fat. And I'll show you some inconsistencies about saturated fat here in these particular guidelines. That's going to make people even more confused. So this is an upside down pyramid. And if you look at the left, like I've been taught, that's where people's eyes are going to go. It's sending the signal we need to eat more protein in the form of meat, cheese, and whole fat dairy. Yes, there's vegetables and fruit, so they do recommend the vegetables and fruit, which is great. But then if you look at the bottom here, whole grains, which are a great source of dietary fiber, is at the very bottom. So this is basically a kind of ketogenic type of low carbohydrate diet, which we know is not sustainable and it's not advised by dietitians and the previous dietary guidelines and this Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. The fats shown here are olive oil and avocados, which, yes, we know those are very healthy fats. I do agree with that. But then there's butter here. Butter is full of saturated fat. And then we also will see in the text, they are recommending beef tallow and some other fat, butter, I think is what it is. And we know that those are high in saturated fat. And so it's just confusing all around. All right, so this is our inverted pyramid here that these 9 individuals came up with. So here the message is eat real food is what they're going for. I do agree with reducing the processed foods and the added sugar. So that message is still there, which is great. But I am deeply concerned about the meat and the cheese and the lack of fiber recommendations here in this particular dietary guidelines. Okay, so let's start here. Eat the right amount for you. Yes, the calories you need depend on your age, sex, height, and physical activity. We all know that and agree with that. Pay attention to portion sizes. I agree. Hydration is key in overall health. They are only saying choose water or still or sparkling and unsweetened beverages. But we know things can still fit, like juices can still fit into a healthy diet when consumed within that caloric level to meet the daily needs of that person. Protein, prioritize protein at every meal. Okay, so they're saying nutrient-dense protein foods as part of a healthy dietary pattern. I do agree with that. Consume a variety of protein foods from animal sources. I agree with that, as well as a variety of plant-sourced protein foods, including beans, peas, lentils, legumes, nuts, seeds. Agree with that. Swap deep fried for other healthier cooking methods. That's still appropriate. Consume meat with limited added sugars or refined carbohydrates or starches. So what they should have mentioned here is reducing the amount of processed meat that one should be consuming, right? So here on the left, they're saying from animal sources, but they're not specifying true a steak or a chicken breast or a salmon steak. They are not advising to decrease processed meat intake, which we know is linked to gastrointestinal cancers and linked to cardiovascular disease risk, lots of different things with these processed meats especially. And then protein serving goals 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight based on individual caloric requirements. Okay. So we know that is different from the RDA, but it's not going to inform the RDA. I actually agree that the RDA is low in protein recommendations and we should strive for higher amounts of protein. We're headed in the right direction, but until the RDAs change, it's going to be hard to adopt these protein goals at a population level. So that's going to be so confusing for not only nutrition professionals, but for the lay public and other healthcare professionals. Consume full-fat dairy with no added sugars. Okay, we know that low-fat dairy is appropriate for a healthy diet, overall healthy diet. They're saying 3 servings per day as part of a 2,000 calorie diet. Full-fat dairy has saturated fat, and so we as dietitians will typically recommend low-fat dairy. or fat-free dairy in some cases, and that can be part of a healthy dietary pattern. So concern about this full-fat dairy. And then I mentioned here about gut health. So I'm really happy as a prebiotic researcher to see this here in the dietary guidelines. I wish they would have focused more on the high fiber foods. There's no recommendation or link to the RDA about fiber. We should get about 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories per day. There's no indication of how much fiber we need to get based on these dietary guidelines. Okay, eat a variety of colorful and nutrient-dense vegetables and fruit. That's great. Eat whole vegetables and fruits in their original form. Okay, but cooked vegetables and cooked fruits can be very healthy choices as well. Frozen, dried, canned vegetables or fruits with limited added sugars should be good options. Agree with that. If preferred, flavor with salt, spices, and herbs. So when I see this word here, it says to me that the public is going to say, oh, I can take the salt shaker and I can just, you add a ton of salt to my vegetables. Whereas if you look at the recommendations for salt, for sodium, they do give recommendations, okay? And they're saying less than 2,300 milligrams per day of sodium. But in above here, they're not saying within the recommended amount of 2,300 milligrams per day. So it's just very confusing. 100% fruit or vegetable juice should be consumed in limited portions or diluted with water. We know that fruit juices and vegetable juices can be part of a healthy diet. Vegetables and fruit serving goals should be 3 servings per day and 2 servings per day of fruits. Previous dietary guidelines have shown that it's appropriate to get 2 servings of vegetables per day and 1.5 servings of fruits every day, and it can be in different forms. So here, just by saying 3 servings per day, well, we know that a serving of lettuce or spinach is going to be different than a serving of asparagus, right? And so it's inconsistent with the actual how much what is a serving? And there's no definition of what a serving should be in these guidelines. Incorporate healthy fats. And they're plentiful in meats, poultry, eggs, which have saturated fat. Again, omega-3 rich seafood. Yes, I agree with that. That's great. We should eat more omega-3s, nuts, seeds, full fat dairy. Again, we've got the saturated fat, olives, and avocados. Okay. Now look next, when cooking with or adding fats to meals, prioritize oils with essential fatty acids such as olive oil. So olive oil actually contains oleic acid, which is not an essential amino acid. So I don't know where they came up with that. And and then other options could be butter or beef tallow. Again, not what the literature states and what we should be using as our added fats. In general, saturated fat consumption should not exceed 10% of daily total calories. Okay, so if we're supposed to eat low saturated fat, less than 10% of our calories from saturated fat, but then we're recommending beef and beef tallow and, poultry, full fat dairy, it's just not adding up. Focus on whole grains, prioritize fiber-rich grains, which yes, we should. But then why is it that the whole grains are at the bottom of the pyramid? You can see my frustration with these dietary guidelines. Significantly reduce the consumption of highly processed foods. Okay, I agree with that. Whole grains, serving goal, 2 to 4 servings per day, adjusting based on calories. And then limit highly processed foods, added sugars, and refined carbohydrates. So yes, I do agree with this. However, if you look their statement here about artificial flavors and dyes, and also they are saying do not consume low-calorie, non-nutritive sweeteners. And we know from years of studies that those can be incorporated into a healthy diet. Many people use aspartame or saccharin or and you have to eat a ton of saccharin and aspartame for there to be any adverse health effect. The amount that we consume daily is appropriate and has not been shown to increase any type of adverse health event. Okay, and then here is their blurb about added sugars, what to look for on the label. And then limit alcoholic beverage. It just says consume less, but it doesn't say 1 to 2 drinks per day, or 1 drink for women, 2 drinks for men should be the maximum, or don't drink at all. It's very, very just vague and confusing. And then here's our sodium again, but then they're recommending adding salt to vegetables. There was another, I think, part where they said, maybe it was the meat part where they could add salt. Okay, and then you guys can read about the special populations of infancy, children, adolescents, young adulthood, pregnant women, and lactating women, and older adults. And then here, individuals with chronic disease, and then vegetarians and vegans. So it's going to be very difficult for vegetarians and vegans to get enough protein in if they just simply look at this picture. Because where are the beans and the legumes and the nuts and seeds? Here at the bottom, pretty much, right? So if vegetarians and vegans are going to see this, it's just going to be very challenging for them as well to interpret, okay, well, how many servings of protein from plant-based sources should I be getting every single day? So again, here's our dietary guidelines. We still need to stick to our roots and go by the actual scientific literature and what the original Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee recommended. Again, they came up with 56 recommendations. These dietary guidelines that came up or were developed by 9 individuals, none of which were dietitians. These 9 individuals used an umbrella review process, and they it almost seems like they just cherry picked these studies to meet the narrative that they wanted to share with the U.S. adult population. All right, so I have no other words. Reach out if you have any questions, and maybe we can do a discussion on the dietary guidelines and how best we can keep the narrative about what's in the science regarding nutrition true to that narrative instead of what is shown here in these dietary guidelines. Mind you, some of the guidelines are appropriate, but some of them are not, and it's just going to be confusing. All right, thank you, everybody, and y'all have a great day.